This is a fan-generated show. If you'd like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our new Rumble channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thrilled to announce the release of my new book, Obama's True Legacy: How He Transformed America. There's a reason why Mike Huckabee calls it a ferocious and chilling read. Order it now at Amazon.com or at FrontPageMag.com. Thank you, and may God bless you. Good evening. Welcome to the Glazov Gang. With us this evening, what a privilege and an honor to have Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, and a million other very impressive and good things. Robert, welcome to the show.
Good to see you, Jamie. Thank you.
Robert, one of the things I didn't mention is you have a new book out.
I do. I happen to have it right here.
Tell us.
Civilization.
And can you spend 60 seconds telling us about it?
It'll be out November 21st, but it is available now for pre-order at Amazon. It is a history of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire, but it's not just a standard history. It explains what we have gotten from them to build Western civilization, how Western civilization actually would not even exist without them, and what we can learn from them today.
Fascinating stuff, and definitely in the context of what's happening in our world, always very vital what you're writing about, Robert. Thank you. Robert, kind of difficult to approach this issue and this topic for many reasons. How do I even describe it? Hamas's diabolical terrorism against the Israeli people. What happened and why is this happening?
At this point, we know that over 1,200 Israelis were murdered. Hamas was able to get jihadis into the country, bulldozed the fence along the Gaza border, and also, of course, famously paraglided jihadis into a music festival where people were murdered wholesale and the women kidnapped and raped. The scale of this is extraordinary. If it had happened in the same proportion in the United States, we'd be looking at 30,000 dead in one day, something like that. And so it's one of the largest jihad attacks in all of history, and one of the certainly most consequential for a number of reasons, not limited to, but including the intelligence failures that led up to it, which have yet to be fully explained, the betrayal of Israel by the United States that led up to it. For example, just the day before it happened, the Biden regime gave $75 million under the table to the Palestinians. And of course, when the Biden regime gives money, and the most notorious incident of its giving money in a way that aided this attack was the $6 billion it gave to the Islamic Republic of Iran in exchange for 5 hostages. $6 billion and 5 imprisoned Iranians for 5 hostages held in Iran. But the worst part of this in regard to the Biden regime is the ongoing assumption that it's Israel's fault, that the conflict comes from Israeli intransigence, and that a certain combination of Israeli concessions will ultimately bring peace. This idea had been the prevailing idea of American foreign policy for decades. It was discarded during the Trump administration, came back with a vengeance with the Biden regime, and it has now borne the fruit that we always could have seen coming. That not only have we bankrolled this attack, but that it is the fruit of all the wrong assumptions and false beliefs upon which our foreign policy in general and our policy toward Israel are based. including the idea that Islam is a religion of peace, that a negotiated settlement is even possible in Israel, that Israel needs to make various concessions to the Palestinians, and many more.
And I think, Robert, due to humans' inability to see and accept the truth, and when I say humans, I refer to many, because they do not include you, me, and Annie on these levels anyway. But I think that those delusions will continue. Where do I even start? Just watching the news, Fox News, any news. Oh, well, then they were screaming Allahu Akbar, and then they go on to the... It's very interesting. Why don't you stop there for a second? What is Allahu Akbar? Why were they screaming it? What does it mean? Did something happen at the Battle of Khaybar where a certain prophet maybe yelled that, and why? Let's invite David Wood and Robert Spencer to explain it. This is an impossible scenario, Robert. Our civilization, our society, I don't think it's even close to accepting these truths. And I think the majority of people are ready and willing to die rather than accept them.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. The capacity of human beings for denial and for fantasy and willful ignorance, it's apparently boundless. And of course, it's compounded in this instance by now 2 decades of relentless propaganda. Not only the insistence that Islam is peace, but also the ongoing demonization of the people who've been telling the truth about it.
Yes.
Fox would obviously never have anybody on who spoke the truth about what Allahu Akbar means.
Yes.
They might tell you God is great, which is widespread fantasy, but it's false.
Yes. Yes.
And let's discuss that in a minute, but they hate the truth tellers. And, I've studied this for a long time. My book, Jihad is Psychopath, touches on a lot of this, just what Stockholm Syndrome is. And when somebody has Stockholm Syndrome, how much they hate the person that's trying to wake them up. But Kenneth Levin this is the go-to man right now. His book, The Oslo Syndrome, and how he diagnosed what happens to communities under siege, and how a large majority of them will begin to believe certain things in order not to face the truth. But let's just talk a little bit about the truths here. The reports have it that not only were these poor Israeli civilians and citizens killed, but they were tortured, and horrible things were done to them, which is a whole other issue about Islam that I want to get to. But it appears that there had also been beheadings, even of children. And of course, we've got the commentators in our media that, oh, Hamas, they must just be really angry, evil people, and they're very bad people, and this is to be denounced. But let's just talk a little bit about here, because maybe they're doing this for a certain reason. See, there was this tribe called Banu Qurayza in 628, if I am correct. Muhammad conquered them and ordered the beheading of up to 600 to 900 men and boys. Is there a possibility that perhaps Hamas is beheading children along with adults, maybe a little bit connected to following the example of what happened at Banu Qurayza?
It's very possible. Remember that the actions of Muhammad are sacralized in Islam. They are the pattern for conduct. The prophet is called the excellent example in the Quran in chapter 33, verse 21. And this is taken in the most literal fashion possible. It means that if he did anything, it's right. And so if he did behead the Jews of the Banu Qurayza tribe, then Muslims can and should do the same thing when they have the opportunity.
Is there a conspiracy right-wing Trump supporter that wrote about Banu Qurayza, or is there a chance that this is in Islamic literature?
This is in Islamic literature. As a matter of fact, I'm almost done with my next book, Muhammad, A Critical Biography. I wrote a biography of Muhammad back in 2006, but this one is different. In that one, I just told the story of Muhammad as it appears in mainstream Islamic texts, but now I'm evaluating those texts specifically from a historical standpoint, comparing different versions and so on. And so I can tell you, I was just working on this over the last few days, that the story of the Banu Qurayza is in the earliest available biographies of Muhammad, written by Muslims and for Muslims. And that's Ibn Hisham, the copy of the biography written by Ibn Ishaq in the 8th century, and then al-Waqidi a little bit later. And there are other sources that refer to it as well. Muhammad believed that the Banu Qurayza had betrayed him during the Battle of the Trench, which was a siege of Medina by the Quraysh, the pagan Arabs of Mecca. And as a result of the perceived betrayal or the alleged betrayal, he did indeed order the 600 to 900 men of the Quraysh to line up by the trench and personally beheaded them, according to Ibn Hisham. And so this is not something I'm making up. This is something in the earliest biography of Muhammad himself. It must be noted, however, we want to be scrupulously accurate here, of course. And so it should be noted that the order that Muhammad gave was to kill all the boys who had reached puberty and all the men, and the younger boys were spared. And so they actually inspected they made them strip and take off their underwear, because that was how they determined if they were mature. If they had started puberty, then they would be killed, and if they hadn't, they would not. But at the same time, there are famous hadiths in which Muhammad says, "Don't kill the women and children." But there's also a hadith in which a city is being bombarded by the Muslims, and somebody goes up to Muhammad and says, "You know, there are women and children in there, along with the polytheists." And he says, "Well, they're from them." In other words, they're just part of the same group, so it doesn't matter. And so there is justification in Islamic law as a result of that statement. It can be argued that the younger ones are collateral damage, or else that they are of them, they are from them. And so it's justifiable to kill them, because they're going to grow up to be men who oppose the Muslims in any case. And so the difficulty you have here is one that was summed up really by Isaiah, the prophet of the Hebrew scriptures, that woe to those who call good evil and evil good, that these people do these unspeakable atrocities, but they actually think they're righteous in doing so.
Thank you, Robert, for always so nobly telling the truth. I have a hard time containing my hatred of the left due to my own background and my family, in terms of what the communists did to my family and to millions of my people, which was all enabled, of course, by leftists, created by the left, but I just mean even in the West, how the leftists enabled everything that was happening and continued to. The left actually has also played quite an interesting role in Israel and in what just happened. So you've got to ask yourself, why is Gaza in Hamas's hands to begin with? I wonder if it's the Israeli left that gave Gaza to Hamas in the first place. And we can talk about that. But what I'm wondering is, in Sahih Muslim, in Sahih Bukhari, where Muhammad is recorded commanding genocide against Jews for all time and place, I don't remember anything in those hadiths where there's a bracket saying, unless the Jews give some land and give some hugs and give some money. It's incredible, just the belief system of those that had the Oslo syndrome, still have it, that, you know, they were given Gaza, they were given land, they were given money, they were given this, they were given that. In Hadith Sahih Muslim 6985, it's the genocidal hadith, Tell us about this hadith. And, you know, just surprisingly, a lot of Muslims take it seriously.
Oh, well, it's a Sahih Hadith. That is one that's considered reliable. And that means that it is normative for Islamic law and practice. And if you are a believing Muslim, then you're very likely to believe that Muhammad said this, that the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And Jews will hide behind trees, and the trees will cry out, "Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." This is indeed Sahih Muslim 6985. It's also repeated in several other places with minor variations. And that repetition is important in itself because it emphasizes for Hadith scholars that this is indeed a reliable narration. In other words, it comes from several different sources. And so that's why it's repeated. And that's all the more indication that Muslims should take it seriously. And notice it's often dismissed as being something that has to do with the end times and some time of final judgment that many people, of course, don't believe will ever happen. However, what it actually says is this: the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So in other words, if you are a Muslim and you're reading this, you can think, I can bring about the last day, the final triumph of the Muslims and the consummation of all things. I can bring this closer right now by killing Jews. The last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. So if I get to killing Jews in this view, then I can help to bring about the final resolution of the entire world.
Robert, you face hundreds and thousands of these people, I think, every day. So do I, especially in my past when I did some, I guess you could say, educational activities, including 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica. Very interesting times of mine. But there's this, like when you and I speak about this, I always remember this certain disposition. There's a lot of people, they hate this. They, no, stop it, no. There's such a reluctance, and they're not actually interested in the facts. I know so many people who cannot make the conclusion that everything that we're talking about, what it leads to, the conclusion, because the conclusion for them, it's just too painful, it's too impossible to imagine for them. And so they would rather fool themselves. And in that fooling of themselves, then they start this, oh, well, you're taking it out of context. Are you getting the real Arabic there? And I just want to touch on that for a minute. The end will not come until you kill all the Jews. Like, why I'm laughing here is it's in a tragic sense. How could that be misinterpreted? What is the misinterpretation? Kill all the Jews. Oh, you know, you're really misinterpreting it. Like, okay, what's the other interpretation when Muhammad is saying to kill all the Jews? What are we missing here?
Yeah, you know, that we're not missing anything, obviously. And I can tell you this is a ongoing and sophisticated and broad-based effort, as you know. For example, for years now, for many years, over 20 years, I've had Islamic apologists tell me that kill them wherever you find them, which is 3 times in the Quran. Chapter 2, verse 191, chapter 4, verse 89, and in chapter 9, verse 5, it says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. That has no application in the modern world. There are so many people have told me this, up until quite recently, as a matter of fact. People tell me, and I've seen people tell other people on Twitter, oh, that had to do with a particular situation in Muhammad's life in the 7th century, and it has nothing to do with anything in the modern world. Now, this was always a flimsy argument because the Quran is supposed to be the guidebook for all time and for human behavior in all cultures throughout history. And so to say that, and there were many other portions of the Quran that have been dismissed in this way as well, that they only apply to the 7th century, they start undercutting their own theology, because it's all supposed to apply to our own age and to every age. But anyway, so I was reading the other day, after this terrible attack in Israel, a Hamas communique, and I put it at jihadwatch.org, and a Hamas commander is saying, we are starting this major jihad operation, and now is the time to kill them wherever you find them. And I had to laugh, because it's tragic and it's evil, but at the same time I thought, these guys are now exposing the lies of their own co-religionists and the Muslim spokesmen in the West, who've been lulling Americans into complacency for all these years. But now the mask is off.
And their hands are drenched in the blood of the victims of jihad, the millions of them, including the poor Israelis that were just massacred in Israel. These deniers, they enable all of that. Robert, just in terms of the Jewish people and how Islam views them, we often hear, when Boko Haram and ISIS talk, and even when a lot of Muslims talk without a membership in these organizations, I've heard it myself. But Hamas likes to talk about this. Fatah members talk about this. They often refer to Jews as apes and pigs. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, they're just angry, and this must be just some kind of cultural expression. Well, there's kind of the Quran, chapter 2, verse 63 to 66, chapter 5, verse 59 and 60, chapter 7, verse 166. Jews are described as the descendants of apes and pigs. This might not lead to good things in terms of how Muslims might treat Jews, right?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, because it's a very common charge from the left that if you oppose jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women and Islamic anti-Semitism and all the other things that are in the Islamic texts, then you are dehumanizing Muslims. Now, I don't know exactly how that works. I don't understand how telling the truth, telling uncomfortable truths about the sacred writings of Islam dehumanizes anybody, because every individual's reception of those texts and implementation of those texts or rejection of those texts is going to be up to the individual. And so there's no one-to-one correlation between any given Muslim and what's written in the Islamic texts. But nonetheless, this is something I'm accused of regularly, that you're dehumanizing Muslims by reporting about jihad activity and by writing about what Islam teaches. And as absurd as it is, I think it's a certain kind of projection. They're dehumanizing the Jews in the Quran and saying that Allah transformed the disobedient Jews into apes and pigs. This is clear and obvious dehumanization. And it's not happening on the other side. As with so many things on the left, they accuse their enemies of what they themselves are guilty of.
Yeah, it's also humorous, at the same time disgusting, how we, the truth tellers about Islam, were somehow painted as haters of Muslim people. I don't know, when I look at what Annie Cyrus has been doing all these years, what you've been doing all these years, what I've been trying to do all these years, trying to protect Muslim people from Sharia, trying to protect Muslim girls from female genital mutilation, from honor killings, and so many things that have kept us up at night. And when you mention something like this to, a leftist or a Muslim person, like even at Jihad Watch yesterday, there was a story you ran of a Muslim husband cutting off the nose and the ears of his wife because he has a right to, etc. We know their names. We are the ones talking about this. We want justice. We want to protect them. And all the left does is say, oh, well, that not all Muslims do that. You should have, you know, they have all these expressions, but they ultimately get a very good night's sleep. And it's people like you and Annie Cyrus, Robert, that don't get a good night's sleep because you and I, we're actually worried about the Muslim people and how much they suffer because of Islamic law.
Yeah, sure. Well, in terms of how much Muslims suffer because of Islamic law, this is an interesting point. The often repeated claim, this is yet another, is that if Muslims are killing other Muslims, and therefore the people who are killing them are not Muslims, are not animated by Islamic principles. And so that disproves the idea that the jihadis have anything to do with Islam, because they primarily kill other Muslims. This betrays an ignorance of the Islamic idea of takfir, which is the declaring of another Muslim to be a non-Muslim for whatever heresy or whatever deviance of belief. And consequently, that person who has been declared a non-Muslim can lawfully be killed. This is something that is in Islamic law. Chapter 4, verse 92 of the Quran says Muslims should not kill other Muslims, but if you say that the other guy is not a Muslim, then it's fair game. You have to wonder, and people often ask me, why is it that anybody would sit still for that, or why women would allow themselves to be so terribly oppressed? And of course, they don't ordinarily have any other frame of reference. If you are born and raised in this, and you are told that this is the gold standard for what's right and wrong and the guide for all behavior, then it's very hard to break free of that and to start looking at it critically from outside. You don't have any outside for the most part to go and stand on in order to examine it. You're surrounded by it everywhere.
Yeah, I don't, sometimes I don't even know where to start. Just also this whole thing, just even a couple days ago, I was told that I'm misunderstanding Islam, I'm lecturing. The issue is not how I'm understanding anything. Just forget about Jamie Glazov. Just, if you're so worried about how Islam is misunderstood, you should be focused on how Hamas, Boko Haram, and ISIS, and Fatah, and Al-Qaeda understand Islam and why. But I'm always very interested in that, how we're reprimanded, that we're not understanding things properly. The issue is how Muslims are getting this message and why they end up killing and raping. Let me save that for a minute, because I want to ask this question, because I think we have covered that very well. Robert, let's get on to Allahu Akbar, which is part of this whole thing. So they mention it on the news, but they don't say anything. So Daniel Greenfield once said something in his writing, that if you're inside the cockpit of a plane and a Muslim is outside the cockpit and banging on the door screaming Allahu Akbar, it's not a good sign and doesn't look good. It doesn't mean God is great. They keep saying God is great. It doesn't mean God is great. It means Allah is greater than your God. That might lead to some problems. There's also a background in terms of who actually yelled this when Akbar was defeated. Give us a little bit of history and context.
Yeah, we mentioned the Banu Qurayza before, and that was one of the 3 Jewish tribes of Medina. When Muhammad moved to Medina in the Hijra, the beginning of Islam, really, 12 years after he had become a prophet, though, in 622, this is all according to the traditional story, he encountered these 3 Jewish tribes, the Banu Kainuka, Banu Nadir, and Banu Qurayza. And at length, he confronted the Banu Kainuka and demanded that they convert to Islam, and they refused, and he exiled them, and they went to Akbar. Later, the Banu Nadir he accused of plotting against him, and they may have been after they had seen what had happened to the Banu Kainuka. Certainly, it would have been understandable if they had been, but in any case, he exiled them, and they also went to Akbar. And then the Banu Qurayza, as I said, were in in the city with him during the siege of the Quraysh, and he accused them of betraying him and murdered them, 600 to 900 of the men, and the women and children went off to Khaybar. Shortly thereafter, he wanted to take the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, in those days, see, people think the pilgrimage to Mecca, that's an Islamic thing. The pilgrimage to Mecca is older than Islam. The Kaaba, the cube-shaped building in Mecca that they walk around 7 times during the pilgrimage, that also is older than Islam. And so Muhammad, according to these traditions, he wanted to make the pilgrimage, but the Quraysh, who were polytheists and rejected his being a prophet, they controlled Mecca. They didn't want him to make the pilgrimage. So he made a deal with them. He signed a treaty with them that was very disadvantageous to the Muslims. And a lot of the Muslims, a lot of his closest followers were furious. And then he got revelations from Allah promising that there would be great reward if they would just be patient. And what the great reward he came up with was they went to Khaybar. Nobody was expecting them. The Jews thought they were done with Muhammad, that he had brutalized them enough, and they were making a life in Khaybar. The Islamic tradition records that the Jews were going out into the fields that morning when they saw Muhammad and his armies. They were going out to work with their spades and pickaxes on their farms. Now, Muhammad struck in the morning, even though he arrived at night. He arrived the night before, and he said, we're not going to attack right now. We're going to wait. And if we hear the Islamic call to prayer in the morning, we won't attack. But if we don't hear it, then that indicates there are no Muslims there, then we'll attack. And so when he didn't hear the call to prayer, and he saw the Jews going out to work on their farms, he called out, Allahu Akbar, Allah is greater, that is greater than the God of the Jews. And now was the time for the Muslims to show that superiority by carrying out the final massacre of the Jews of Arabia.
And so when they yell, I was told several days ago, a guy told me Hamas are not religious people, that they're not really real Muslims. Then I wonder why they're screaming Allahu Akbar. I don't know, it's a real mystery. But speaking of Khaybar, Robert, 17-year-old Jewish girl Sophia somehow ended up being Muhammad's wife after that. I don't think that was really voluntary on her behalf. And it's very interesting why Western feminists aren't upset about this.
Sophia was the wife of Kinana ibn Arabi and the daughter of another man named Huyai, and had seen both of them murdered on the day that the Muslims arrived in Khaybar. The Muslims got a report that Kinana, her husband, had the treasure of the Banu Nadir and had hidden it somewhere. The Banu Nadir being one of these Jewish tribes of Medina, that he had carried this treasure to Khaybar and was hiding it. And so Muhammad ordered that he be tortured until he gave up the secret of where the treasure was. So they lit a fire on his chest, and they're slowly burning him to death. And he still refused. He actually didn't have any treasure, or he was determined not to give it up. But in any case, he didn't have anything to tell them. And so finally, Muhammad ordered them to behead him, and killed her father as well in the battles for the city. So then they were distributing the spoils of war. And it's a stipulation in the Quran, chapter 8, verse 41, that the Muslims have to give a fifth to Muhammad. That is, whatever they get, 20% goes to Muhammad. And so they were dividing up the possessions of the men of Khaybar, and that included the women, who had been also taken as spoils of war. And remember, the Quran also allows Muslim men to take infidel women as sex slaves, women who are captured in battles. And that is the captives of the right hand. And it's referred to in chapter 4, verse 3, chapter 4, verse 24, chapter 23, verse 1 to 6, 33:50, and 70:30. I give the verses because people always say, oh, you're lying, this isn't true. So look it up. And you'll see the captives of the right hand are spoils of war, and the permission is explicitly given that Muslims are allowed to have sex with them. So they're essentially sex slaves.
And Robert, and there's a possibility that the women in Israel that were just taken hostage are part of this equation.
Right. And so they are following in the footsteps of Safiya, who she was given to one of the Muslim warriors, but then Muhammad saw her and she was very good looking. So he said he took her for himself and told the guy that he would get her a different woman. And then he essentially raped her while they were still there in Khaybar with her father and her husband just killed and the dead bodies all around. Before they left the city, he consummated his supposed marriage with her.
Robert, it doesn't sound like you understand that jihad is actually an inner spiritual struggle.
Yeah, there's no basis for that in the Islamic texts. There is a spiritual struggle, and there are all kinds of meanings of the word jihad, which just means struggle. And just as there are all kinds of meanings of the word struggle in English, you can struggle, have the civilizational struggle against communism, and you can also struggle to be punctual. It can be used in great and trivial contexts. Also, in Islam, there are all kinds of jihads, but the primary jihad is warfare against unbelievers. And the massacre at Khaybar is a quintessential jihad.
We are graced by the presence of our producer, Annie Cyrus, who is a scholar of Islam and also, unfortunately, experienced Islam firsthand. Annie, what are your thoughts during these days? What are your thoughts about our discussion? Would you like to add something?
Sure. It's a little hard to add anything when Robert Spencer is talking because he covers everything. But one thing I will add is I understand that mainstream media and a lot of news coming out of that area is talk about Palestinians and Israelis and Palestine versus Israel, Hamas versus. I just want to make it very clear what we're witnessing from Saturday of last week until today and whatever comes tomorrow, as it's been called for the Day of Jihad or Global Jihad. It is not about one group of people against the other group. It's genuinely Islam versus humanity. You don't have to understand Islam to see this. You just need to look at every single Islamic attack and Islamic jihad and Islamic terrorist to understand when it comes to movements of Islam. The first thing that is overlooked is humans. They don't see you as humans anymore. If you're a Jew, you're an ape and a pig and a monkey. If you're a Christian, you're just an infidel who has turned your back to Islam because you were born a Mohammedan and then your ancestors walked away. So if we keep that in mind, it might be easier for us to know how to pick a side. It's not about a group of people, it's about humans. Pick a side, and the side should be humanity. But if you choose to pick Islam, don't expect people like me to have any sympathy for you or forgive you for whatever has happened so far, for your sympathy for Islam or for your love for Islam or for your fear of Islam. That's all I have to add.
Golden, very profound words. Thank you, Annie. Robert, your thoughts on Annie's contribution?
Well, of course, Annie is quite right and has lived through all this. The point about being dehumanized is extremely important. We touched on it a bit with the discussion of the apes and pigs and all that, but it's more than that. There are passages in the Quran. Chapter 8, verse 55 says that the unbelievers are like animals. Chapter 7, verse 179 says they're like cattle. And so the dehumanization is taken on a very serious level by many pious and believing Muslims, such that when they talk about human beings, they're only talking about Muslims. And they're quite seriously excluding others. And so it's important sometimes to bear that in mind when you're reading some things that they say, and they talk about the human cost of various actions, or how all human beings reject this or that, or how this is something that threatens every human being. More often than not, they're not talking about all human beings the way that a Westerner. They're talking about the Muslims only.
Yeah, they're very clever when they say we're against civilians being killed, but it's very the moderators and hosts don't follow up and say are unbelievers or Jewish people or Christian civilians, right?
Yeah, they were killing innocent people, and yet all non-Muslims are guilty for rejecting Islam.
Yeah.
There aren't any innocent people among us.
Robert, very briefly, please, because unfortunately we just have a few minutes left, but I would love it if we had a couple hours. We just came out with a book, you and I, in our own way. I was the editor. You wrote the powerful essays along with other brilliant people. Barack Obama's True Legacy, and you have a few very powerful chapters in there. And I think we could very safely say that what just happened in Israel in terms of Hamas's terror, Obama played a large role in empowering and enabling that, and enabling the power of Hamas and Islamic jihadists in general, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Obama administration was a big turning point for the United States in so many ways. And one of the primary ways was in solidifying a hostility to Israel that emanates from the left. I think ultimately the left is deeply anti-Semitic. We saw Stalin was about to embark upon a major pogrom against the Jews when he died, and it's little remarked. But of course, the radical left, the Marxists, they're collectivists. You can look at Mao's China and how everybody was wearing those little suits. You know, everybody was the same. Individuality was discouraged, was stamped out, was explicitly warred against. You only had any meaning as part of a collective. The Jews historically are the foremost opponents of that idea. For 2,000 years and more, they've been minorities in countries that were often quite hostile, and never succumbed to the temptation to take on the ways of the majority and lose their own distinctiveness. And so that is the quintessential anti-leftist position, even though, of course, there are a lot of leftist Jews. I just don't think respectfully that they've thought this through, that this is the left's antithetical to the left's idea of destroying the individual and subsuming the individual into a collective. The Jews are the standing rebuke to that notion. And so the left wants to destroy them. Obama solidified that in many ways by legitimizing the Palestinians, aiding the Palestinians, giving the impression that the Israelis were entirely at fault, as I started this discussion tonight, talking about a lot of this started with him.
Absolutely. You know, I was just about to ask a question, but you answered it right before I asked it. I've been dedicated to this issue, my book, United in Hate, The Left's Romance with Tyranny and Terror, and I was always fascinated and continue to be, and not in a good way, with why the left sides with these monstrosities. But they did it during communism, they did it with 9/11 and afterwards with jihad. You know, they have a romance with communism, romance with jihad. Now it's continuing. You just had an article at Front Page and at Jihad Watch, and you write about it at Pajamas Media. The left is actually cheering for Hamas. You gave many examples. Just very quickly, just conclude on that, on how the left's romance with jihad is continuing now in terms of the context of just what happened.
Well, also, of course, both the left and the jihadis are authoritarians. They hate dissent. They want to crush it. We see that with the Biden regime and its disinformation governance board and its crackdown on dissent on Twitter and so on. And we see that with Islam in the prohibitions on the criticism of Islam or Muhammad or the Quran. And so they see each other, I think, as deep ideological kin. They both want to establish an earthly paradise, the work paradise of the Marxists and the Sharia paradise of the law of Allah being implemented, and both proceed according to a reign of terror. The left always institutes a reign of terror when they take charge, and Sharia is a reign of terror. You know, you get out of line, they'll stone you to death, behead you, cut off your hand, whatever. And so they love each other.
And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, for us as Christians and with our Jewish brothers and sisters, although we have some differences theologically, heaven and paradise comes from the Lord above. We don't get back to Eden on our own. We need God's help for that. And so that's a main cleavage in that way. Robert, always fascinating, and a little bit of even therapy to speak with you, Robert, because after listening to all the garbage on the news day after day, you get to talk with Robert Spencer, and it's better than any tranquilizer or therapist.
Well, I hope I don't put everybody to sleep, but thank you.
No, when I say tranquilizer, I don't mean to get to sleep.
This guy's the best tranquilizer in the world. You're having trouble sleeping at night? Get his new book.
I more meant for the soul in terms of to hear the truth from you. Thank you, Robert. Robert, before we go, where should people be checking you out?
Jihadwatch.org is updating many times daily with many more stories than ordinarily about the jihad against Israel over the last few days, but we cover jihad all over the world. And I'm at Jihad Watch RS on Twitter. I've got 27 books on various aspects of this conflict, including the Palestinian delusion, the catastrophic history of the Middle East peace process, which explains a lot of what's happening now. And that and my other books are at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold.
I should have said that you're a stimulating tranquilizer.
Stimulating tranquilizer. I see.
Okay.
Hot cold.
Robert, thank you so much. Keep up the good keep up the good work, and we love you, and we're cheering you on in your fight for the truth and for freedom. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining the Glazov Gang this evening. Make sure you're subscribed to our Rumble channel and hit the notification bell. We need your help. We need you to keep watching because it's a catastrophe over at YouTube. Good night.